Hello chess fans, this is Rick from Chess to Impress. The Candidates Tournament started on March 17th, 2020. The first half of the tournament was played and round 8, the first round of the second half of the tournament, was supposed to be played on March 26, 2020. But then Russia threatened to close its airspace and the tournament was stopped. And we had to wait 389 days for round 8 to really happen. But the waiting is finally over. And these were the standings after round 7. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Jan Nepomniachtchi were leading the Candidates Tournament with 4.5 points out of 7 games. In the last round, Vachier-Lagrave had beaten Nepomniachtchi to join him at the top of the table. 4 players a full point behind: Caruana, Giri, Wang and Alexander Grischuk. 2 players with a lot of ground to make up to become Magnus Carlsen's next challenger: Liren and Alekseenko. The winner of the Candidates Tournament will play against world champion Magnus Carlsen in Dubai in November and December of 2021. And on Monday, April 19th, these were the pairings for round 8. Fabiano Caruana against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, Wang against Liren, the old China clash, Jan Nepomniachtchi against Giri, and Alekseenko against Alexander Grischuk. The game between Wang and Liren was the first one to finish. Let's see what happened. Wang was white and opened with the e-pawn, e5 from Ding, knight f3, knight c6 and d4. We have a Scotch opening on the board. Let's play through the opening moves quite quickly. Both players played a theoretical variation that has been played many tens of thousand times before. Bishop a6 is not blundering the knight on d5, because if you take it, your queen is hanging. After bishop a6, b3 was played, g6 and bishop a3. Wang said after the game that he wanted to check his opponent in this line and he was hoping for the move d7, d6 from Ding, which was not played. That's the move that Wang was hoping for, which he had prepared. It appeared first in a Kasparov-Anand game. At least that's what Wang said in the press conference after the game. The interpreter translated it as Topalov-Kramnik, which was quite funny. Ding was not tempted to play this line, which he once played in a rapid game that he lost, so he decided on another move to simply equalize. The players looked at this variation in the press conference. E takes d6 is the move here. Queen takes e2 and bishop takes e2, and that was Wang plan. To play this endgame, which his compatriot Wai Yi had successfully done in the past, it's not risky for white at all. So white can play for a win without risking anything. But as said, after bishop a3, Ding did not go for d6, he played knight b4. Bishop b2, bishop g7, a3 kicking the knight back, knight d5. You can still not take it because your queen is still hanging. So after knight d5, knight d2, developing that knight, was played by Wang. Both players castled, king side and queen side, rook fe8, and now g3 is an option that Wang showed. But he thought that white can then not play for an advantage, so he chose queen f3 instead. Knight b6, and now king c2 is interesting. Ding admitted that he did not know this move. It was shown by Wang but knight e4 was the move he decided on in the end. Swaps on e5, knight f6 check, with a fork, forking king and rook. King f8 and knight takes e8. And now Ding said it's really only black that can play for a win. Wang said it's just a draw. Queen a1 check, king c2, another check, king c1. Ding took on a3 with check, king b1, and now his intention was to take the knight on e8 and try to play for a win, but he decided against it. This was the line shown in the press conference. Queen c3, threatening to infiltrate on h8, so king g8 is the move here, then king c2, and this game should also end in a draw. Don't play d7, d5 as both players showed, because then rook a1, and this is a winning position for white. Ding saw all this after king b1, and he decided not to take the knight on e8, he decided on knight a4, and it looks dangerous for white, but it is not really. Don't take that knight, because you get checkmated, rook b8 check, king c2 and mate in 2, like this. So after knight a4 you can't take the knight. There's a checkmate threat of queen b2 checkmate, so you have to defend against that. Wang Hao played queen f6, defending the b2 square. Queen takes b3 check, king c1, another check, king played, queen a2 check, king c1. Don't go to d3, because then after knight c5 check, the white king is too exposed and black will win. So king c1 was the move, and a few more moves, and on move 28 after king c1 the players shook hands and the game was drawn. Not a very exciting game between these two participants from China. Ding remains at the bottom of the table and Wang Hao has to quickly start winning games to get chances to win the tournament. The second game to finish was tournament leader Jan Nepomniachtchi with white against Giri with the black pieces. Nepomniachtchi opened with the e-pawn. Let's put the opening moves on the board. We have a Sicilian and more specifically the Sveshnikov, which was a big surprise to Nepomniachtchi and for which he had not prepared for. Giri said that he gave Nepomniachtchi the chance for a fight with his opening. It's one of the favorites of world champion Magnus Carlsen. The players played the main line, c3 to prepare bringing the knight back into the game. The knight will go to c2 and then to e3 to get back into the game to a better square. Here castling kingside is the main move according to theory, but rook b8 was Giri's choice. White brings the knight back into the game. Let's put some more moves on the board. a3, a5 and queen d3, which Nepomniachtchi afterwards called a quite clumsy move. I should have played bishop e2 or bishop g2 to develop that piece. But he played queen d3, knight e7, knight c to e3, and now black took on e3 with the bishop. It seems odd to just give up the bishop pair like that, but as Grandmaster Ramirez in the St. Louis broadcast said, if you play the Sveshnikov for long enough, you find out that you have to part with your king's bishop. Don't take with the queen, that's a strategical mistake because of knight takes d5, e takes d5 and then f5, and that's good for black. Nepomniachtchi knew that, he took back with the knight, and the players looked at b5, b4 in this position. Giri was of the opinion that white had somewhat misplayed the opening, with white's bishop still on f1. He said that he felt he could play for an advantage. He also looked at f5. That's a move that Giri considered to do something dynamic with a white king in the center, but found out it doesn't work. In the end he did not play b4, he didn't play f5, he played bishop e6. The game went on. Let's put more moves on the board. Castling from white on move 22 and rook fb8. Giri said, I feel that if I control the d5 square in the Sveshnikov, then I'm fine. Nepomniachtchi said, I have a superior knight on e3, but the players agreed that the position is quite dry and very equal. Let's continue the game. Bishop d1 and here bishop c4 is an option. Knight takes, b takes and not much is happening. In the game bishop e6 was played instead of bishop c4 and now we get a move repetition like this. And after the 28th move bishop d1 back to g4. Both players agreed to a draw. This game was too subtle, said Giri, and Nepomniachtchi said white achieved nothing out of the opening and the game was a quick draw. Giri said both sides were kicking the ball in the middle of the field from one player to another. Nobody took a shot, to give a soccer analogy. So we had a second draw in this round in the tournament table. The last two games were marathons. They both lasted 74 moves. Let's first look at Fabiano Caruana with the white pieces against joint leader Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. And as you can see on this picture, it was the 12th world champion Anatoly Karpov who made the first move for Caruana. Very nice to see him. And here a picture of Caruana drinking and Vachier-Lagrave thinking. 74 moves, so let's go through the opening quite quickly. It was a Sicilian and Vachier-Lagrave always plays the Najdorf. Vachier-Lagrave always plays this opening against e4 and it's easy to prepare against him because of that, but of course he knows everything about it. And we see the poison pawn variation. Vachier-Lagrave takes on b2. Rook b1 kicking the queen back. And we see a theoretical line on the board. We go to move 15, queen e3 and queen takes e5. And if we do a body count, we see that black has now won 3 pawns. The pawns on b2, a2 and e5. And here Caruana played c3, and that's a novelty in over-the-board chess. It had only been seen in a correspondence game. Caruana blitzed out his moves. He was in his preparation. Bishop g5, bishop g3, kicking the queen. Queen stepped aside. And now look at this move. On move 18, Caruana corked out this one. Bishop f1 to c4. Is it a mouse slip? No, it is over-the-board chess. It's definitely not a mouse slip. He's just putting the bishop en prise there. And it's a real novelty, never been played before. And Caruana said after the game that this was an idea from his second, Rustam Kazimjanov. Black really has to take. Bishop d6. Black is a piece and 3 pawns up. But what a minefield he is in. Vachier-Lagrave played knight f6, giving the piece back straight away. It's the best move. Caruana said after the game that he was quite upset that MVL found this very difficult move. Vachier-Lagrave said it was the first move he looked at. Of course, instead of knight f6 he cannot take that bishop because of a family fork. So knight f6 was played, knight takes e5, taking the piece back. Of course black is still 3 pawns up. Knight d5, queen e5, attacking the pawn on g8. And now look at this move. Just rook g8. With everything that's going on, MVL simply defends the g7 pawn. And Caruana keeps sacrificing. Knight d takes e6, f takes, knight takes, and black can at least swap the queens, get the queens off the board this way, and now knight c7 check. What a crazy game this is. King f7, rook d3, and now knight e4, deciding to sacrifice an exchange. Rook a7 is the best move according to the engine, and that saves the rook in the corner. But with knight e4, MVL decides to give an exchange. Caruana castled with check. That doesn't happen too often, that castling goes with check, but it does in this game. King g6, and now Caruana takes the rook. Knight c6, knight b6, rook d8, knight takes c8, and rook takes c8. And now we have a position that we can understand again after 30 moves. Black has 2 pawns for the exchange. MVL said in a press conference after the game that he thought he should be able to hold it quite easily. Caruana also thought this should be holdable for black. He did not really see how to make progress. The game goes on. Let's put some more moves on the board till we get to the next critical moment that the players commented on in the post-game interview. G takes f6 and now h4. h3 is another option which was suggested in the St. Louis broadcast. White does not want to swap pawns, and this move keeps more pawns on the board. As we'll see, the pawn is weaker on h4, and black will be able to swap a pair of pawns. Very instructive. h5. Carlsen said in the Chess24 broadcast it would be advisable for Caruana to burn some time on the clock now, as if there is a fortress position then MVL will most certainly find it. Carlsen mentioned that he thinks this is one of MVL's strengths in chess, tenacious defending and finding fortress positions. Let's keep the game going. We have 74 moves to cover. Knight takes h4 and rook takes h5. Indeed, black has been able to swap a pair of pawns, which is in his advantage. Knight g6, rook check, king e6, and rook takes b7. Knight e5, that's threatening knight g4, winning an exchange back. So king h3 is possible. Caruana said after the game that maybe he should have played that to keep the rooks on the board. That was another try, but Caruana decided to swap the rooks with rook b6 check. Rook c6, and you have to swap the rooks now because knight g4 is still a threat. The general consensus from the grandmasters in the different live broadcasts that I followed was that trading off a pair of rooks was a mistake, and that keeping all the rooks on the board would give more practical chances for white. Rook takes, knight takes, king g3 and king f7. Grandmaster Alejandro Ramirez made a funny comment here that in a way it's easier for black to draw this endgame by grabbing his a-pawn and throwing it out of the window. Black wants two things: keep the white king out of h5 and put his own knight on g5. That should be a fortress that can't be breached, but easier said than done. So that's the goal, keeping the king out of the h5 square. And in the press conference after the game, both players were talking about that square as well as something that white wants to achieve and black wants to avoid for the white king to go to. Rook c2, and here knight e5 was seen as more sensible, keeping the knight closer to the king. The a pawn will be lost anyway, but knight b4 was MVL's choice. Let's keep going because we're only on move 47. Let's go to the next critical moment. Both players were playing around a lot, as you can see. Knight f5, rook d3, and now a critical moment. Knight h6 was played by MVL, but knight g7 seems a better move. The computer plays this endgame perfectly, so the so-called table basis could be used by the analyst in this position, and knight g7 is indeed better than knight h6, but it's very difficult to foresee. Let's keep going. And here rook h3 is mate in 40 moves according to the table basis. Don't ask us why, said the grandmasters in the live broadcast, so I definitely am not going to try and explain why rook h3 is mate in 40. King f5 was played by Caruana, and the game went on. Let's go. This is move 63, and king e4 was played on move 65. Knight g8, rook h3, king g6, rook a3, and now a very important moment. If black plays knight e7 here on the 67th move, then white is not really making progress, said Caruana after the game. This was the critical moment, he said. Because instead of knight e7 he played king f7. And now there is king f4. And MVL said, now I cannot prevent the king from running to h5 and it is all over. Let's keep going. See what happened. There is that king on h5 and now the position is winning for white. g4. Caruana had calculated it to the end. King e5 and king g6, and here Maxime Vachier-Lagrave resigned after 74 moves. White will be able to give his rook for knight and pawn eventually and then win with the g-pawn. There's no way now for MVL to save the game, and MVL did not let Caruana show how to win this from here. What an important win for Fabiano Caruana, who was on 50% after that first half and starts with a win against the co-leader Maxime Vachier-Lagrave in round 8. The last game to finish was the all-Russian clash Kirill Alekseenko with the white pieces against Alexander Grischuk on the black side. Here we see both players and we see the handshake after the game. Let's see what happened. Another marathon game and we see the French defense on the board. Let's play all the way till move 18. And we'll see another poison pawn variation where black takes on b2. I've always been taught never take a pawn on b2, not even when it's good. But that doesn't apply to super grandmasters. Rook takes b7. White also takes the b pawn. The queens come off the board. And here rook h2 b1 is a natural move, doubling rooks on the open file. But knight d1 was played by Alekseenko, a somewhat mysterious move. One idea is to bring the knight to e3 to support the f4, f5 push, but that won't happen in this game. Bishop d8, knight e3, bishop c6 and rook b2. Alekseenko said that this was an important move. It protects c2 and in some lines a knight on g2. Well, this is a very deep line. Castling from Grischuk, bishop c5 and rook e8. Alekseenko showed a line after the game. That was bishop h4 check and then g3 and d4. Attacking the rook in the corner, and then he had planned to interpose the knight. And now black's rook, bishop and pawn are hanging. So you have to take on g2. King takes, rook fc8 and bishop takes d4, and this is good for white. Nice variation. But in the game rook e8 was played instead of bishop h4 check, and let's put some more moves on the board. c4 on move 22, and let's go to move 28. King e4 and rook c8. An amazing fact was that Grischuk, who was a notorious time trouble addict, had more time on the clock than his opponent. At this moment in move 28 he had 16 minutes left on the clock versus Alekseenko only 7 minutes. Knight d4 was played, bishop c4 and rook d1. Alekseenko is finally bringing his king's rook into the game on move 30. a5, a3, g6, the rook went to b7 and bishop f6. That is not dropping that bishop because the white e-pawn is pinned to the rook on e8. Let's look at what happened then. King d4, attacking the bishop, bishop b3, and now you cannot take that pawn on d3 because there is rook takes d6 check, and that pawn on e5 is still pinned, but now because of the bishop on g7. In this position Alekseenko decided to give up on an exchange. He took on g7 with check, king takes, and now you can take on d3. Alekseenko said, "This is slightly better for me, with no risk. The only player who can win this is white." Very strong bishop and supported by a very strong pawn. a4 and knight d2 with the idea to bring this knight to c5 through e4. Alekseenko said black cannot allow that. He has to take the knight before it gets to c5. And that's what happened. Bishop e6, the knight went to e4, and bishop f5, which is pinning the knight. Unpinning the knight, and the knight gets taken before it can get to c5. Let's keep going. We have reached a time control. This is move 42. Put more moves on the board till we get to the next critical moment. Rook b7 is move 50, and here Grischuk played g5. Rook 2 to c7 was a better move for black, said Alekseenko. The move from the game, g6, g5, should also lead to a draw, but is more complicated. Let's see what happened after g5. Alekseenko took the pawn on h7. Grischuk took on g2, king d6, and let's again put more moves on the board. And we get to move 58, which is the crucial moment in this game. Rook a to g8 was played by Grischuk, and that's a big mistake. It blunders the pawn on a4, believe it or not. King f5 should have been played, and I cannot improve my position, said Alekseenko. For example, bishop d8, then there is rook a7 check, and it's hard for white, impossible for white to make progress. But after rook a to g8, Alekseenko played a simple rook e4, and that wins the a4 pawn. Here Alekseenko showed that Grischuk had a last chance with king h5, then white takes, but then there's counterplay with the g-pawn. You have to give your bishop for it. Rook takes, you can promote. Rook takes, king takes, and this is hard to say, said Alekseenko, but this should be a draw. The black king is miles away from the a-pawn, but this position might be holdable for black. So after rook e4, king h5 was the last option, but king f5 was played by Grischuk, and that doesn't work. Alekseenko gave a check, king g5, and now took the pawn on a4. This is move 61. The time control was reached, the second time control. The players got another 15 minutes on the clock. And Alekseenko said, I understood that my position was completely winning now. My e-pawn is extremely strong, and black's g-pawn is controlled by the black bishop and rook. King h4, but the g-pawn cannot play because of the pin. Rook e4, rook a8, a4 to keep the pawn, king g5 and a5 protected by the bishop. Alekseenko said this was the last precise moment to keep the a-pawn protected. Keep the a-pawn on the board. Rook h7, king c6, and we see a move repetition to gain some time on the clock. And now rook e3. Rook h2 e8, king d7, king f6, a check, king f7, rook back, king f6, and now the winning move, bishop d8. The rook on d8 is now hanging. Grischuk saw nothing better than attack white's rook. King takes, and king f8. And white will promote first, and the g-pawn is still far from the promotion square. Here Grischuk resigned, and Alekseenko had won his first game in the tournament, while Grischuk, after 7 draws in the first half of the tournament, suffered his first loss. So these are the results. 2 wins for white and 2 draws. Caruana beat Vachier-Lagrave, Alekseenko beat Grischuk, and 2 draws between Wang and Liren, and Nepomniachtchi and Giri. And that leads to these standings. I took this screenshots from the ChessBase website. Jan Nepomniachtchi is leading the Candidates tournament by himself with 5 points out of 8 games. 2 players half a point behind, Fabiano Caruana and Vachier-Lagrave. 2 players half a point behind them, Giri and Wang. Grischuk and Alekseenko are on -1, and Ding is on -2 with 3 points out of 8 games. Round 9 will be played on Tuesday the 20th of April, and we'll see Alekseenko against Caruana, Grischuk Nepomniachtchi, Giri Wang and Ding against Vachier-Lagrave. All the 3 leaders have black in the 9th round. I will be here after the round to tell you what happened. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you'll keep following the Candidates tournament with me on Chess to Impress. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, please subscribe to the Chess to Impress channel, and please leave a comment. I will read them all and I will reply to them all. If you like the video, it would be great if you could share it on social media by clicking the share button on YouTube. You can find me on Instagram, on Twitter and on Facebook. This is Rick for Chess to Impress. Thank you for watching.